What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. That's right. Where for like 16 years. Next week, we've been delivering up the ideological goodness, ingredients for you to think, reflect, and brew your own faith. And today, returning to the podcast is one dynamic duo. Prepare yourself to apprehend the persuasive call of process relational thinking about deep religious pluralism with the one and only Catherine Keller and John Thatamanil. That's right. John Thatamanil, professor at Union Theological Seminary, Catherine Keller at Drew Theological School, and both of them were live at the very first God After Deconstruction event right there in New Jersey at Drew. And we had ourselves a good time, and this is a live podcast where we are exploring deep religious pluralism. It's a fun conversation with two regulars here at Homebrewed Christianity, and I hope you enjoy it. And when you hear this and you go, whoa, you and Tom put on this big event, God After Deconstruction, and I didn't even get to go, well, you can come join us in Denver, Colorado, April 11th through the 13th. We got two big fun events going on there. First, we got Persuade, which is about open and relational and process preaching. And if you're a clergy, you can come for all 3 days. If you're not, then come on out to God After Deconstruction the 12th and 13th, where Tom and I are going to be joined by some of our favorite friends, Mark Feldmeyer, Kathy Escobar, Tim Burnett, Nicole Trubitsky, all up in the house. Casey Sigmund. Look, it's gonna be fun. We're going to nerd out, and we're going to be thinking about God After Deconstruction. If you want to learn more about those events, or guess what? Tom and I have already recorded 10 videos tackling the 10 big questions around deconstruction. Then go to GodAfterDeconstruction.com. You'll not only be able to grab these videos, like around 30 minutes each, you can use in a group, but over the spring, we're going to do a series of live streams answering questions between us and some of our friends, and it's going to be a good old time. So go to God After Deconstruction. You can use the videos on your own, use them in a small group, come hang out with us in person in Denver, and but thank you, Catherine and John, for an amazing conversation. Recorded live on the campus of Drew. Now, buckle your theological safety belts. It's time to nerd out.
Most of you know that Catherine Keller is a professor of theology here, and here at Drew, the school of, how do you say it? It is the Theological School at Drew, or how do you say it? Drew Theological School. There we go. And of course, she is not only beloved by her students, but by Tripp and me and so many other people who've known her over the years. And it's such a joy to be here in her home turf. And we thought we've got to feature her at this conference. And then, of course, we have a major expert in the religious pluralism in John Thatamanil, who's at Union. Yeah, that's right. We got the Union folks here at Union Theological Seminary. And so we thought in this particular God After Deconstruction event, we would kind of focus, we'd dive in on one of the reasons why people are walking away from faith, walking away from church, God, whatever. And that is this question of multiple religions. Religions, diversity, religious pluralism. And so tonight, Tripp is going to engage these scholars. So please welcome them.
All right, dude. Okay, this is going to be fun. If you are ever interviewed one person you know is brilliant and compelling, and then you're like, that was easy. But if you interview two of them and you fail, then you really judge yourself. So I'm optimistic that I won't ruin your experience of Catherine and John's brilliance. Now, talking about religious pluralism, there are two words that showed up consistently in the survey, and oddly enough, normal people don't go, I'm interested in the question of religious pluralism. Right? And the two adjectives that kept showing up as something like diverse or difference. Now, both of you in different ways have explored how diversity becomes an asset for people of faith. And thinking not so much directly towards our kind of academic peers, but in your own experience, can you kind of share a moment where, in looking back, this encounter of difference or diversity became a site that was fertile for theological reflection that you may have not anticipated?
So it's worth remembering for those of you who have always perhaps known me as somebody working on questions of religious diversity, that I grew up in a fairly evangelical milieu too. My particular Indian Christian church, the Martoma Church, though it has a long history that goes back, according to tradition, all the way to St. Thomas, did pick up an evangelical ethos in, I think, its formative 19th century context, with the Church Missionary Society influencing, the Anglican Church Missionary Society influencing our particular tradition. This means that somehow when I got to the U.S., I was surprised to find that all the songs that I knew in Malayalam had already been translated into English. And all the evangelical tunes, the good ones. There shall be showers of blessing, and all these kinds of, mainstays. So, though my particular tradition version of evangelicalism was a kind of social gospel, evangelicalism, progressive, it still was very traditionally evangelical in many ways. And this is shocking and disappointing to me, but one of my best friends, if not my best friend in my first year of college, Amit Shah, told me that he experienced me as someone with a kind of evangelical zeal to his Hindu self. that whatever I might say about my own, I've always been progressive, apparently in college I was still trying in some soft way to save my Hindu friend, right? So that's disconcerting to me, because the person I am now can't imagine doing something like that, denying my friend the riches of the tradition in which he grew up. So it's as though my life with him must have somehow provoked the transitions. Regardless of any revisionist stories that suggest that perhaps I've always been progressive on this issue. I grew up singing songs like, "Must I go in empty-handed? Must I meet my Savior so? Not one soul with which to greet him. Must I empty-handed go?" Did you sing that?
Oh, I've heard that song.
Yeah. Literally, like you're a teen and you're like, holy crap, I haven't saved anyone yet. If I die now, I will arrive at heaven empty-handed. Imagine the effect of this kind of fervor being transmitted to a kid. So this is to tell you that, I don't think people know that this is the framework in which I came, but it was, in fact, the lived experience of going to college, living with Hindu friends and Muslim friends, that only began the process of the transformation. Yeah. Yeah.
I think my story might be the inverse, or maybe it's the obverse, or the odd verse. But it would be that I grew up with no stable location, no stable tradition, a very complex, talented, alcoholic, war-destroyed psychic situation. My mother read tremendously. She married someone who was, a veteran of the German army and was mentally destroyed. And so we couldn't keep jobs. We moved constantly. There was no religion. My mother was someone who wanted to be a painter, very abstract kind of painter, and had nothing to do. Neither had her parents had anything to do with all that religious nonsense. So that's my background. Incredible instability, but a lot of love and, some literature coming through it. But, going different places on the planet. We did have 4 years in Greece, but every place else was much faster. So there wasn't a tradition. And so the breakthrough for me was when, by the grace of God, my stepfather was able to keep a job in the area of Atlanta for 3 whole years. That was more settled than we'd been since I was a very small child. And I discovered there at age, 13, the Methodist Church, the youth group. And that was so transforming. It was a liberal Methodist church. It was basically by the side of the campus of Emory. Mm-hmm. We just happened to fortunately live in that neighborhood. After a while, I even tugged my folks to come to church occasionally, and they didn't mind it so much. And Tom Altizer occasionally showed up at that church. Wow. So it was a good death of God Methodism. Drew has that death of God heritage of the Methodist Church as well, a bit of it. So it wasn't a conversion to a deeply evangelical faith, but it was a conversion to the evangel. I started reading the Gospels, and I loved that this could be brought into discussions with the youth group about problems that I was having with, boys and teachers who I thought resented me because I still had a bit of a foreign accent, but I could work it out. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was in a deep sense an evangelical experience into liberal progressive Methodism out of that chaotic agnosticism, if that helps.
No, it does, because I think that one of the things that's striking in reading so many of the responses to the survey is that oftentimes these issues show up and there's 2 different forms. The same question gets raised in a form from those that have a very energetic native faith that they're born into that frames these questions. And then there are those that have these very same questions, but they're experienced from a different angle. Like the problem of evil is a question that gets raised in all sorts of different ways. What you make of the animating multiplicity of religious traditions gets framed differently from different contexts. And yet you could see expressions of it, right, coming from people with different kind of origin stories of sorts. When it goes to the question of religious pluralism, as people who have helped hundreds of future clergy raise the questions theologically, I'm interested in the kind of dominant framing of religious pluralism that you were taught in seminary and such, like the maybe not exactly yours, since Catherine had John Cobb's version, which is like the edgiest around at that point. But how has the growing diversity of our student bodies in theological education, the growing multiple religious belonging of congregants and things, changed the way, as theologians, we think about pluralism just over your own life and time in theological education?
You want to go first?
I don't mind.
Yeah.
Let me hook back just a little bit into sources for religious diversity that were in my life. There was an old copy. It was already getting old, of Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, from Alan Watts, that was in my home, because Alan Watts had given that to my mother. He was, I think, attracted to her during our couple of months in San Francisco. Yeah, it was a strange family, but an interesting one that I came from. So she didn't read that, but I found and for me that was transforming, and helped to then build on what I had been experiencing in the Methodist Church. That is the reality of a whole spiritual dimension and practices that I might secretly do on my own. So that mixed in, and also my bloodfather was Jewish, secular, but I always understood myself to be part Jewish, half Jewish in that way. I kind of held on to that, and I still do. I married a Jew. So Jewish, Buddhist, Christian, and I love my yoga practice. Yeah, so and all of that is made possible for me really by discovering John Cobb, and I did discover his Christ in a Pluralistic Age early in my last year at Eden Seminary in St. Louis. It was just there on the bookshelf in the bookstore, and I just sat down on the cold floor as a basement and kept reading and reading. And, in that book, he makes clear that it is Christ, this cosmic logos Christ. It's Christ the Logos that was calling Christians to interreligious encounter. He found that it was Christ who particularly called him into deep engagement with Buddhism. And as he would say later, called him to become a Buddhist Christian. This totally worked for me. His serene, lucid, utterly orderly voice, the opposite of my background, but with this rich diversity, which was what I had the possibilities for in the background. So it was very much John Cobb. And at my seminary, there was also one Alan Miller, who was a Tillichian. He didn't write a lot, but he was very active in the World Council of Churches, and who just kept protecting me from certain other professors, like Walt Brueggemann. Anyway, he kept protecting me and my strangeness and giving me this big Tillichian space, and in it also is, just profound respect for all of the wisdom traditions of the world. And it was partly through him that I bumped into John Cobb and, Whitehead at first, and then that all began to cohere.
And it's JC's 99th birthday today. Oh, that's John Cobb. I've proselytized for more than one JC.
JC.
Just Catherine, John Cobb, Jesus.
I like that. Yeah. I'll send your happy birthday wishes to him. I would have gone to his birthday celebration, Tripp.
Wow, that's one less soul I'm carrying.
Well, I think that, like Catherine, we're both odd in many ways. But one of these is that we've both had seminary experiences that were vastly different, and I would argue far more sophisticated than most seminary experiences continue to be today. And before I get to seminary, I should say that my dad's first cousin, who was a professor at the University of Bridgeport, in my last year of high school Sunday school, required us to read what was then called The Religions of Man by Houston Smith. So somehow I got this weird composite of wanting to save souls, together with a total acceptance about the legitimacy of having read that book during high school. So that's strange right there. And then when I got to BU for Div School, for Boston University School of Theology, my teachers included John Berthrong and Robert Neville. And Berthrong is among the first persons to write about multiple religious belonging. His book, The Divine Deli, was decades in advance of this, and I suspect it was because he was a sinologist. So he was well aware that multiple religious participation, far from being an aberration or a weird part of North American life, though now increasingly normative, it was just the way of religious life in China. You were Confucian for some reasons, Taoist for others, Buddhist for others, and Christian for weddings. Because you get the tux and the white dress and so forth.
Well, that's just how Jesus described it in Matthew.
Right. So, I think because he that was so formative for his own imagination as a Confucian Christian. And by the way, Bob Neville also called himself a Confucian Christian. So I was taught by two people for whom serious multiple religious participation was normative. Bob is a Tai Chi expert. So I have no idea how I lucked into that. Providence or not. But in that respect, I would say that most institutions are only just catching up to what Bob Neville and John Berthrong did.
Well, one of the difficulties, I think, for thinking theologically about pluralism when the framing is so distinctively siloed, right? It's Christian theologians thinking about pluralism. Is that oftentimes, right, like in our congregation, you have people of multiple religious belonging. And yet what has made most denominations distinct theologically is how we differ from our other Protestant Christian neighbors. And then what gets emphasized in your congregation. Like, I know why we're not Free Will Baptists and Missionary Baptists. And it wasn't until I moved to a city that I met a real Methodist in person and found out that they weren't Catholic, right? So in rural North Carolina, the religious diversity was the kind of Baptist you were, right? So this framework, even within denominations, oftentimes is like, oh, well, how did you define yourself in relationship to difference among your own tribes, not in a world that's benefiting from the diversity and difference among the wisdom traditions? How do you how would you describe the invitation to avoid a kind of relativism in relationship to the diversity and rejecting the kind of absolutism that both of your own stories kind of falsify?
Well, Tripp with his easy questions. That one's a doozy. I think, again, it's helpful that these things happen in the context of a lived life, where it's not really, you might sort it out conceptually later, but then well before you sort it out conceptually, you're actually, and this is right to ask the autobiographical question, you're actually living through it. And I've spoken uncharacteristically for an academic theologian about my own religious experiences. You're strongly dissuaded from doing such things in the academy in the name of objectivity and being taken seriously and the like. But I grew up for a good bit of my young life, particularly in high school and college, with a profound sense of divine immanence, just the nearness of God. So much so that to say that God was an other seemed a thing that would falsify that experience. Now, I couldn't have told you that in those words, right? I could not have articulated that well. But when in Sunday school, you're introduced to a hint of Advaita Vedanta, of non-dualist Hinduism, and then you take courses on Hindu philosophy in college, you suddenly are confronted with a tradition for whom this is the significant and final claim.
Yeah.
Right? That God is not a being among beings, but is your true self. Tattvam Asi, you are that. And I thought to myself, wow, that's a heck of a lot more resonant with one of the major keys in which I live my religious life. Now, I love praise songs too. So there are moments in my spiritual life where it's very clear that I'm praising the one who is not identical with me in every sense. But here is this other part of my life that seemed to me to be true, and then I find out that it's not just true for me as a matter of my personal experience, but that it's a major strand of Hindu tradition. And so out of that experience, you realize, wow, it might actually be the case that different traditions groove on different religious intuitions, or they constitute themselves around different religious intuitions, and that those differences are not reducible to sameness, nor can they be rank ordered. Right? That intuition, I suspect, was in my body well before I wrote it down in paper.
And would you say that part of the task to honor the multiplicity of traditions and the multiplicity of kind of the difference in phenomenology of the divine of sorts, that these traditions encounter the divine and orient the person differently. Like, part of honoring that is describing ultimacy in a way that the actual testimony of people's lives and encounter with the divine is included in the picture, right? In that sense where, yes, you had these experiences as a Christian of that intimate nearness, nearer than you know yourself, and the other who is a mystery that you love and seek after. Oftentimes we have to collapse one into the other. And then, you can write in your journal about the two intimate nearness, if you need to. But that theological task, it kind of involves a shift from how a lot of people think about religion, namely as a list of ideas, right? So now the theologian is actually trying to honor the actual lived religious experience of the people encountering God, and not tell them, please go find my answers in your lived religious experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is why Catherine and I, among other things, wrote this Polydoxy volume together. We both love this word, though we don't tend to use it a whole lot, in part because at the time in which that book came into being, there was some apologetic energy towards a certain radical orthodoxy that we wanted to contest. And neither of us are given to apologetics. But the term polydoxy means a lot, I think, to both of us. Because and I was going to say this tomorrow, maybe I'll skip this part of my talk tomorrow as a result. Because we don't want to honor framings of tradition in which the only two options are you're orthodox or you're heterodox. You're orthodox or a heretic. And that there's a single way of being an Orthodox Christian.
Yeah.
Because that erasure of diversity within one's tradition ruins the possibility of other kinds of more complex recognition, right? I came around to finding Tillich sort of the long way around. And then I discovered that there's whole tradition of Christian mysticism in which God is nearer to me than I am to myself. I didn't need to go to Shankara to have that affirmation. That's part of my tradition too. But that took the long way around to find these depths in my own tradition. It's in Augustine, it's in Eckhart, it's in Tillich, right? So shutting off the internal multiplicity within one's own tradition shuts down these moments of cross-tradition recognition. It squelches one's own religious experience. If you can't say and recognize that in your own tradition there are multiple ways of encountering the divine, how are you going to recognize that in other traditions?
Yes. Well, it's even crazier if you, what if you canonized even just 4 different non-congruent accounts of the life of Christ?
Imagine that.
And then figured out how could we get everyone to read these with the theological conclusions of anti-intellectual 17th century American frontier preachers.
Yeah. Catherine, you want to weigh in on this?
this. Yes. I'm thinking that one way of conceiving of the problem is in terms of deconstruction. After all, that is, that deconstruction really is a form of honoring of the unknowing, right? Mm-hmm. To deconstruct is to undo a presumed construction, not so that one offers instead destruction, but one lets the construction be transparently a construction. Mm-hmm. And this is awfully important in relation to religious multiplicity, because inasmuch as we are able to recognize that our own religion is a construction, a faithful, profound, historically charged, and perhaps spiritually illumined and illumining construction, collective, historical, but that it is a construction and that it is larded with unknowing. We call that mystery. And therefore, there is an inherent deconstructive element in any religion that is being taken seriously, in which case it takes its mystery seriously. It's not afraid of all the boundaries of its knowledge. Faith goes there with a kind of adventurous trust. But then, recognizing that about one's own, it becomes possible to recognize that other religious constructions abound, and that they share this character of being able to be deconstructed and being able to deconstruct, and yet at the same time they are offering significant truths, truths that are all the more honest because of the way they deconstruct themselves. Some religious traditions are much more manifest in this, like Zen, which is systematically unsays any possible proposition about the truth of the Buddha. It just has the Buddha laugh out loud at any dogmas about the Buddha. So if we can share a certain spirit of constructive deconstruction, I think we're able to open ourselves into a rich pluralism. And I guess the other thing that's important is that pluralism by itself is not enough. Just honoring difference is not enough. What matters is the relationships between the differences, right? What matters is the connectivity of that pluralism, that in connecting with you in your great difference, I don't need you to fuse with me and become one with me, or the other way around, but rather I experience myself as enriched by your difference. And the more we can stay connected in our difference, the more complex, challenging, and lush our experience is becoming, right? So bringing that sense of relationality is crucial. And I don't want to be dogmatic about this, but I think I did maybe a whole book really going on and on about how we get often trapped between the religious absolutes and then reacting against them into religious relativism. So we bounce back and forth between absolutism, we've got the truth, and relativism, what's truth? And, instead, perhaps, there's a third way that is that of relationalism. I think on the mystery I said, you've got on the one side the absolute, on the other the dissolute. But the third way might be the resolute. where we can make strong relational, ethical, social just choices, ecologically rich choices with great resolution. And that's not being absolute, and that's certainly not being dissolute.
No, I think that's really helpful because I think one of the anxieties that we're facing culturally is when so much God talk is treated as if you're describing an object, then that's just uncomfortable. I mean, technically it's idolatry, but nonetheless, but that invitation to relationality is something that kind of reorients, just like the pushback y'all gave of Polydoxy, right, to the radical orthodoxy movement and that kind of like a certain assertion of orthodoxy in a rather tyrannical type way. I think that shift of thinking about theology from logos to poetics is another way at getting at it, because relationality involves the other's genuine subjectivity and their real mystery. Like, just because I know both of you more now than I did the first time I met you doesn't mean I've collapsed your subjectivity in the object of you in my head. And anyone even my children and my partner, I may know them better than I know anyone else, and they may know me. But like, part of a real relationship is they get the dignity of the mystery of their subjectivity. And it's kind of weird that millions and millions of people think they have clarity about God's divine objectivity and can't even figure out how to work things out with the person they promised to. Right? We kind of know how to do it when it goes to relationships, but somehow when we get to God, we don't even know where to begin. And you could even spot that difference, right? There's a difference between like a logical syllogism and a love poem, but you can definitely say they're true, but the true's getting at something different. And when you confuse the two, it gets really, really sloppy. But like, if we sat and told stories of the people that we loved the most, I could recognize the love in your account of that relationship without wanting to call them up and see if they're free on the weekend, right? Because that is your beloved, but love I recognize. And that even that gap of recognizing love in a different and not your own story and celebrating it, that distance between the recognition of love and one's particular beloved, I think shows that we do have a kind of poetic recognition of depth that we haven't figured out how to internalize within our religious traditions. And that's one of the reasons I love, like, especially in the classroom, going, let's talk about theopoetics. Because I think poetics is a different orientation that still is inviting the use of language, but it's language that's true more like a poem than like a syllogism.
And it lets the logos come into its poetry again.
Yes.
Right? I'm not interested in getting rid of the word, but letting its profound poetic reverberations loose in the world. And remembering, of course, that poiesis doesn't just refer to poetry. Its original meaning is making, right? Making, constructing. That's poiesis. So it's interesting that in that term, the lyricism of poetry is working together with creativity or the creation.
I think you're pointing to something so rich that I've only begun to think about a certain conundrum. I am concerned about representation, even recently, where someone, maybe even something I was reading, talked about how Protestantism is belief-centered. And I thought to myself, really? Would Luther or Calvin recognize Christian faith as reducible to propositions? Somewhere roundabout. But that said, I don't think you can get literalism and a form of faith that insists on confessing certain literal propositions until a number of things happen. First of all, you need access to the literal biblical text, which most people did not have until the invention of the printing press. Then you need a certain way of reading narratives that forgets that they're narratives, and that they contain various genres. You have to flatten the text before you can get to propositionalism. Like, to be a Christian means to affirm these propositions. So one of my mentors said, this all could not have happened until after the Enlightenment. And he had a very clever way. I write this on the board for my students so they sort of see what's entailed. He said that until you had people like Strauss and others, Enlightenment thinkers, who said, the Bible is not literally true, that you could have somebody say, oh, it's not true that the Bible is not literally true. And then suddenly, what drops out? Right? Everything except literal truth. Do you see what I mean? So his argument was that the emphasis on literal truth is a result of a double negation. Somebody first had to say, the Bible is not literally true, before the fundamentalist is born and said, no, that's not right. It is not true that the Bible is literally true.
It is a reaction.
Right. So literalism has to emerge through a complex process. And it is so new, historically speaking, that it defies the imagination that it could get so fixed as a, if not the dominant way of engaging belief. Now, I think then this way of thinking, this literal way of thinking about God, begins to interfere with our relationship with God. And this creates a kind of bifurcation between many of us who want actual relationship with the divine, but somehow we're operating in a cognitive key that I have to get the right propositions in line in order to be faithful. So I think this creates a kind of split. I think actually it disables active religious life because, as you say, if you're in real relationship with someone, you will not try to reduce them to propositions. Yeah. If I write, something to my wife in a couple of days because it's Valentine's Day, and I start describing her as about 5'6", and and having a very descriptively accurate depiction of her red hair, it's not going to go well for me. Right? The language of relation is the language of poetry.
Yeah,
but if your faith has to operate in the key of proposition, your relationship with God is compromised and perhaps even fractured irreparably. Because if you can't access God poetically, you're not in relationship. You're just lining up your propositions.
Yeah.
That's why theopoetry matters.
Can I
pick
up? Yeah, right. No, I think it's beautiful to connect relationality with poetics in precisely that way. I wanted to get back to the question of religious multiplicity because I brought along a little test case that's kind of important for me. Islam, which I have no personal connections with, unlike several other religious paths. Even voodoo, that's why I came to Drew, right? Because Karen McCarthy Brown, professor of voodoo, was teaching here. So if you sense some strange spirits here in the chapel. But Islam has been always quite foreign for me, and yet increasingly through the years I recognized how crucial it is for any future of a livable planet for as many of us as possible to come to much better terms with Islam. And this always now for me gets tested out around the question of the planetary ecology and global warming. It's like the bottom line for why the religions of the world need to cooperate so that we have a world in which, like our religions have some sort of a future. And there's this little bit from the Quran that I occasionally get back to because it's strange and foreign for me and therefore kind of revelatory. It's important to Islamic environmentalists. And it's Quran 17. Is it okay if I read? It's not very long. The seven heavens, the earth, and all that is within them give glory to Allah. There is nothing but gives glory to him with his praise. There is nothing that does not give glory to him with his praise, though you do not understand their hymns of praise. He is most forbearing, exceedingly forgiving. In other words, human beings are only some of those among the earth and the heavens who give praise, but we miss all the other creatures that do. And then in another verse, thus we have made you trustees, kulafa, on the earth after all the others to see how you would act. So the others are trustees too, all the creatures created before us, but now we're getting a chance. How's that working out? So there's a profound sense of stewardship really being environmentally tested here. And it's just an example of something that's, I think there's nothing explicit like that in either of our two testaments about the testing out of our trusteeship after all of the other creatures have been making their contributions. That's just an example of how one wants to live into these potentials for coalition.
And even that kind of the potentials of coalition is a different orientation towards religious pluralism and diversity than the kind of colonial inheritance of Christianity, right? Like that coalitional opportunity has already started to see the difference in our neighbors precisely as neighbors to have a coalition with, and then what do we each bring and how do we contribute and how do we partner? And I think it's even in the congregational settings, oftentimes congregants were much more interested in figuring out how to have cooperation to do beautiful and just things in the world. And then they look at you and go, so what's the Bible verse you use after we do these things? Because the only one my conservative friends tell me about when we do this is John 14:6.
Yeah.
Right? And so I do think that what we're increasingly in situations, that being one of the examples of even, what generates deconstruction. It's like the lack of engagement in science and around the environmental crisis of what happens when the site of reflection is cooperation for our creaturely well-being together versus, competing for eternal destination spots. And
yeah, and I guess there's no terrible harm in repeating some things in tomorrow's lecture, but among the consequences that we are currently recognizing, only in the last few decades, more so in Canada than in the US, is the tremendous harm, even genocidal harm, done to indigenous communities in North America, empowered by exclusivism. Mm-hmm. And the erasure of these peoples and their testimony and their modeling of right relationship with land has done colossal and possibly very near irreparable harm. Mm-hmm. Now, surprisingly, we're living in a time where indigenous voices, like many that I teach, including most prominently Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, is finally being heard. And we are just now starting to be able to recognize that the very possibility of human inhabitation on this planet depends on a serious and substantive recovery of indigenous ways of being in the world. Mm-hmm. So, and it's precisely because their ways of being are not ours and are not identical to ours that they have a gift to give. Mm-hmm. So this is my analogous to what Catherine's doing with respect to those Quranic passages. We need our neighbors in their difference. We don't need others to be us. We don't need to commit to ways of living that seek their erasure through boarding schools. In Canada, they're called mission schools, residential schools. So those places where we're recovering the bodies of indigenous children. And now that we have our first Department of the Interior indigenous secretary, I'm now temporarily blanking on her name, Deb Haaland? Yeah. Right, we are finally beginning to recognize the reality of what those schools did. And in Canada, where this work is now a few decades in advance of what's happening here, hundreds of bodies are being unearthed at these places, children's bodies. And these schools were run at the state's behest, but by Anglicans, by Catholics, by every denomination, basically. Mm-hmm. And that should tell us what religious exclusivism has generated. It's catastrophic. It's unspeakable.
Yeah. Both of those examples, I think, are compelling. That kind of if that exclusivism generates mutual destruction, and I think what both of you gave examples of is like how much more exciting is it to engage in mutual transformation, where religious difference and diversity means encountering the beautiful fruit of divine entanglement with other people's context and traditions, and then we figure out how together we transform one another towards flourishing in the present. Like, I think so often when we don't actually articulate the beautiful gift that diversity can be, and religious diversity could be, and how mutual transformation is a new way of encountering the divine otherness and its mystery in intimate ways, then it's you either get those very bland pluralistic affirmations, or in all the places where silent and ambiguous, exclusivist renderings of our faith creep in. Even in congregations, that where the pastors would have never said that, but the cultural dominant version of Christianity pushes it in. And I really think that the invitation of mutual transformation is possibly more exciting than the invitation to help your neighbor who's kinder than you avoid eternal conscious torment.
But it's challenging, right? The mutual transformation isn't necessarily a symmetrical process, because the kind of destructive systemic patterns that we're hoping to outgrow with this differential relationalism are based on, profound patterns of racism towards the indigenous people, towards people who were indigenous in Africa, who we kidnapped and keep oppressed, and so the forms of racism and injustice and LGBT, et cetera, keep our forming the coalitions always very challenging, because one wants to enter into mutual relation for purposes of social transformation and ecological renewal with a kind of egalitarianism, and yet there are such profound wounds to the texture of interhuman relations. That just getting our own interhuman ecology healed seems crucial, and yet we can't wait to fix our interhuman relations, like let's solve racism before we work on the environment. It would be great, except then there might not be that environment in which our new racially equal society could exist. So we do need an earth an actually vibrant earth to live on. So it's tough. We have to work with intersections within intersections within intersections. A whole ecology of planetary intersections, but always with that intersectionalism that womanists have framed so powerfully at the heart of it.
I have a sense, and I suspect you probably have the data on this, but I've been thinking why the category spirituality means so much more than the category religion, as in spiritual but not religious.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And I think it is the consequence of what I said earlier about propositionalism. What people who are engaged in spiritual disciplines of various sort are seeking is what they found the opposite of what they found profoundly dissatisfying about creedal faith. Believe this, confess this, and you're in. Really?
And you're in a very separated institutional
Absolutely.
structure. Yeah.
Where there are no disciplines transmitted. Where there's no affective life being enriched, where there's no movement towards a greater intimacy with the divine. And so, of course, any reaction is going to be a reaction, even if it's a profoundly compelling reason. If you move to a spirituality that reacts against a certain feature of one's own confessionally driven propositional tradition, you will begin to do practices, but then there are all sorts of issues that rise to the surface that we explore with my students in my course Double Belonging, including questions of appropriation. Can I really just start doing these practices without actually knowing anyone from these traditions? Right? So, I mean, while I'm sympathetic to that attempt at healing, at saying, I think I need my body to do certain things, not merely confess certain things. I might need to get on my yoga mat. I might need to go to a Buddhist, meditation practice. Well, that's right. That intuition, I think, is spiritually keen, but it can go awry, not least because everything we do in the society operates within a capitalist frame. Right? If I can buy it, it's mine. Right? So if I get a Lululemon yoga mat and get the Lululemon clothes and the latest apps on which, I do my meditation, I'm good. Right? It's like slow your roll. You might think that these are your practices, but your actual practices are the practices of commodity fetishism and capitalism, right? It's just acquiring by other means. Yeah. Only these are supposedly the good things to acquire. I'm not sanguine about that.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason Jesus only said you can serve God or mammon, and he didn't say anything about other religious traditions.
Absolutely. This is one of my insistent, right? That is the one moment in the biblical text where Jesus says no dice to religious multiplicity. He doesn't say to the Syrophoenician woman, you got to rethink your practices. Or he doesn't say to the centurion, you're worshiping the wrong gods. But you try to do that mammon stuff, the mammon and God stuff, it ain't going to work. Right? But what is the favorite form of American religious multiplicity? It's trying to be a capitalist Christian. That is the primary form of double belonging that we practice in North America.
Well, John decided to land the plane just to keep everyone really excited. You join me in thanking Catherine and John for a fun conversation.
Hey, you listened all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you go to godafterdeconstruction.com where you can grab yourself the 10-video series that Tom and I made, sign up for the live streams, or perhaps if you're in the Denver area or you're a clergy looking for some continuing ed, you come hang out with us in Denver this April for the preaching conference in God After Deconstruction live. And if you want to come to Denver, consider coming to Theology Beer Camp this October 17th and 19th. It's going to get